Hey up. Right, choosing suspension upgrades for your Royal Enfield Interceptor 650, or in this case the Continental GT650. This one's been a bit of a journey for me over the, last 6 months? And I've sort of ended up where I started. Now, this sort of applies to all bikes really. I've done several suspension upgrade videos over the years, for the Triumphs and for the Royal Enfields, and they all provoke sort of the same questions and comments. So the intention of this video really is to sort of arm you with enough information to make an informed decision as to what to go for, and to dispel at least one myth in relation to the front suspension and the YSS upgrade kits that are fitted to the Interceptor 650 and will be fitting to the Continental GT. Now, the suspension on a bike represents probably one of the most important factors for comfort and for good handling. And in actual fact, Royal Enfield have done a really good job of it compared to some other manufacturers, but it's nowhere near perfect. Whether the stock suspension setup is going to suit you is very dependent on you, to be quite honest. Your style of riding, your weight, your size, whether you carry a pillion or not, and the type of roads you routinely ride on. Some people are going to find it fine and they'll be wondering why I'm making this video, and some people will understand exactly where I'm coming from. In my case, I found both the front and the rear undersprung and a little bit underdamped. And the issues are more obvious at the front end than the back end. Initially, you might find that the bike is fine, but springs relax over time, especially in the first few thousand miles. So what seems fine when you first collect the bike, over time can start to feel a bit sloppy. Now, there's not a lot you can do at the front end, but at the rear end of the bike you can of course increase the preload. But factory suspension only has a limited range of adjustment, and later in life you can find that you run into problems. You basically run out of preload adjustment when it comes to carrying passengers or luggage, or both. And eventually a lot of us decide that the only way to get around this is to upgrade our suspension. And when we start looking into this, it's like opening Pandora's box. For some people, money is no object. But for most of us, the price of those upgrades is a major consideration. And spending the equivalent of a third of the bike's original retail price just sorting your suspension out is just not an option. Due to regular requests that I've received through the comments section, I spoke to both Öhlins and to K-Tech. Both companies that come up in conversation quite regularly, and both companies were quite willing to participate. But the elephant in the room with both these brands was that a top grade suspension upgrade in both cases was going to cost around about the £2,000 mark. The Continental GT is a £6,000 bike, so that figure for the upgrade constituted a full third of the on-road new purchase price for that bike. And although admittedly I don't have any experience of K-Tech, although I know they are a renowned British manufacturer of suspension components, my previous experience of Öhlins was never really a great one. I've had Öhlins suspension on 3 motorcycles, and although my experience of the suspension itself was good, I was always left feeling that somehow the advantage that these systems afforded were not commensurate with the price that was paid. And I've learned over time that the higher up the price scale you go with suspension upgrades, the less value for money you get. It's an exercise in diminishing returns. What I mean is, you can spend £500 on a set of shocks and get some really good, competent shocks. But spending £1,000 on shocks doesn't necessarily get you an extra £500 worth of value and performance. The more you pay, it always seems to me, the less you get in return for the extra expense. Now, in both cases with the Interceptor and the Continental GT, they come with sort of pseudo piggyback rear shocks. Now, I may have been a little unkind describing them as pseudo, but the truth is we don't know what lies underneath the skin. It's impossible to make a quality, true piggyback shock for less than £300, or should I say make and retail one for less than £300. And the reality of life is you're unlikely to get a piggyback shock worth having for less than £400. And bearing in mind the retail price of these bikes, I think it's very unlikely that Royal Enfield spent any more than about £20 per shock, and I'm pushing it a bit there. I think I'm safe in saying that Gabriel, the makers of these shocks, have probably put most of the budget into making them look as premium as possible, which means they will have had to cut back on the internal components, hence the less than desirable performance that these shocks put out. Of course, the first notion that comes into your head when it comes to replacing these is to replace like for like, replace them with a similar looking piggyback shock. Now, a dependable, good quality piggyback shock is going to cost you at the very least £400, but when you're talking about the likes of K-Tech and Öhlins, you're looking at the thick end of £1,000. And as much as I tried, I quite simply could not justify making a video on a shock like that for either of the Royal Enfields. Contrary to what a lot of you believe, making you part with as much cash as possible is not the brief of this channel. That's not what it's about. It's about trying to provide you with value for money. Now, I suppose we ought to talk about what the difference is between a standard traditional shock and a piggyback shock. Well, to be honest, the difference isn't huge. They both work in exactly the same way. But back, I think, in the 1980s, maybe the 1970s, piggyback shocks were developed for track use and off-road use. All of these shocks are oil emulsion damped. They contain a specific weight of oil which is forced through a damper which slows down the spring rate to control the spring when you're going over lumps and bumps. If it didn't have that there, your back suspension would be bouncing all over the place. Now, in the top part of these shocks there is gas. Sometimes it's air, although not very often, only in your very cheapest shocks. More often than not they'll use nitrogen. Because it's thermally more stable, that is, as it heats up, it doesn't lose its damping properties as much as other gases. So what you've got basically is a mixture of oil and air damping that control your spring rate. Now, back in the 70s or 80s, they discovered that under sustained, demanding racing conditions, both the oil and the nitrogen would get hotter than was desirable. And they would start to lose the properties required to actually damp effectively, and you would get damping fade. And they would, in extreme conditions, partially lose damping control of the spring. Now, the solution was to put this little canister on the back. That would contain the nitrogen for the gas component of the damping and rebound, and because it was in a remote reservoir from the main body of the shock, it was less susceptible to heat build-up. Not only that, because there was now more room in the shock body, they could put more oil in there. And because you had a slightly higher volume of oil, it meant that you had more time before damping fade became a problem, because the higher volume of oil would take longer to warm up to that critical point. Now, piggyback suspension doesn't essentially perform better than standard suspension. What it does is the piggyback design gives it more stamina. It can maintain performance for longer under very demanding conditions. To be honest, conditions that the likes of you and I are rarely, if ever, going to subject the bike to. A properly designed and built piggyback shock is, without a doubt, the gold standard. And as far as these YSS shocks were concerned, it was a no-brainer because they were in a very attractive price bracket. As some people commented 2 years ago when I made the video for the Interceptor, it is overkill, but it's overkill that comes at a very attractive price. you've got a proper competition grade shock with preload, damping and rebound adjustment at a very realistic price. And after 18 months of use, to be honest, I can't fault them. They represent superb value for money. And I have to say, I have found them superior to some Öhlins items that I've used in the past. Which is why I was reluctant to showcase, if you like, or review similar shocks from Öhlins and K-Tech, because they were twice the price. They were unlikely to provide that much of an advantage for the additional cost. So I started to look at both brands' traditional shocks, which again both work out at about the same cost as these YSS piggybacks. And I eventually realised that what I was trying to do, I was just trying to find another brand to show you. And I was sacrificing value for money in order to do it. So I ended up with these. Now, to all intents and purposes, these are the same spec YSS shocks. They're just the standard version and not the piggyback version. But in sacrificing that little bit of top end performance, you're getting a 30 or 40% reduction in price. A full spec track grade shock with micro preload adjustment plus adjustment for damping and rebound. Now, I think in general the price of these YSS products have come down slightly in the 18 months or 2 years, whatever it was, since I last reviewed them. Probably due to the popularity. But that means that whereas in the past some people were having to choose between upgrading the rear or the front suspension because it was coming out to nearly $1,000 for the two, if you implement the use of these standard shocks instead of the piggyback shocks, more people are going to be able to afford to upgrade their entire suspension system on the Continental GT or the Interceptor for round about the same price that the piggyback shocks cost 2 years ago. I've compared these shocks directly with the piggyback version that I have fitted to the Interceptor. There's no compromise and there is no difference in quality. It's simply that you don't have that piggyback canister on the back. Fair enough, if you've got the extra cash to splash, by all means go for the piggyback versions, they're fantastic. But if money is an issue and you need to keep control of the finances for your bike addiction, and you're willing to forego that 1 or 2% performance increase that the piggyback shocks will provide, these are worthy of consideration. And these are exactly what I've decided to fit to the Continental GT. A set of clean, pure, track grade shocks with a traditional classic silhouette that will take handling and comfort on the Continental GT up to the next level. Now, when I made those videos about these YSS products a couple of years ago, I dealt with Wimoto. Unfortunately, my contact at Wimoto has now left. So I sourced these shocks and the front fork suspension upgrade from, you've guessed it, Hitchcock's Motorcycles. Now, I will be publishing the full fitting video of both these shocks and the front suspension upgrade in a future video, hopefully within the next 2 weeks. Now, at the time of publishing those last videos, a major sort of question or criticism cropped up about the front suspension upgrade. And this same question or criticism keeps cropping up. To be honest, I think it's just a product of, you know, the internet. Sort of pseudo-experts overthinking things, flooding the internet with their opinions, and then all of a sudden there's this myth circulating that you have to do something that really you don't have to do in order to make this front upgrade work correctly. And in the process they're either putting people off making this upgrade, or they're persuading people to cause permanent damage to the motorcycles in the pursuit of a performance enhancement that doesn't exist. In fact, you know, it stands to reason you're going to make matters worse by doing it. Now, this YSS front fork upgrade comes with preload adjustment. It also comes with a pair of cartridge emulators. Essentially, these are a secondary damper that works in tandem with the OEM damper that's already fitted to the bike. Now, when I fitted this kit 2 years ago, I adhered precisely to the YSS fitting instructions. But I immediately started to get comments from people saying that I'd done it wrong and that what I should have done was drilled out the OEM damper before fitting these. Well, there's no mention of this in the YSS instructions, but the reason I was given was that this fork upgrade wouldn't work properly unless you did that. Now, how could that be? At the time, I spoke with WeMoto, who liaised with YSS. And at the time, YSS's official reply to this claim was that these are a secondary damper designed to work in conjunction with the OEM damper. They're specifically designed to enhance the effect of the OEM damper. They're not a replacement. So if you destroy your OEM damper, which is what you're doing when you drill it out, you're seriously reducing the advantages that this kit is designed to provide. I mean, it's just ludicrous. Now, I've dealt with this comment, this claim, dozens of times. I don't know how many times, to be exact, to be quite honest, in the comment section of that video, because it's still cropping up even now. And in a conversation that I had with Dan from Hitchcock's a few weeks ago, they're also getting this question from people, you know, do I have to drill my damper out when I fit this? Because obviously people are apprehensive at causing permanent damage to the bike when they're fitting something like this, and quite rightly so. Now, it's a real shame that people just make these things up and then profess them as fact to everybody. I know that this has caused a lot of problems on various internet forums, and they're often very similar comments to the ones that I get on this channel. You know, somebody will pipe up and say, oh, well, when I fitted this kit, I drilled the OEM damper out at the same time and it works much better. And my reply to that is always the same. You know, if you drilled your OEM damper out at the same time you fitted this kit, how do you know it works better than it would have done if you'd left the damper intact? And one of two things always happens. One, they don't reply, or two, they don't reply and they delete their original comment, because it's just dawned on them that they've probably made a huge and costly mistake. This upgrade is completely reversible. It does not cause any damage to your motorcycle. If you're thinking of making this upgrade and some fool is telling you that you've got to drill out your OEM damper in order to facilitate fitting this kit, just ignore them and consider unsubscribing from that particular forum, because people are just leading you up the garden path, and I've got no idea of the motives for doing it, other than that some people will go to extraordinary lengths for a bit of attention. Apart from anything else, this cartridge emulator is held in place purely by your spring. It's not fixed in place. So it's just common sense that if you're going to try and rely on this emulator as your primary oil damper, that is going to be compromised by the fact that it's pushing against a spring which moves. The whole system relies on that primary OEM damper to do its job in order for this cartridge emulator to be able to do its job. When you think about it, it's all common sense. The YSS fitting instructions do not recommend anywhere that you drill out the OEM damper, so there's absolutely no reason why you should be compelled to do it. Now, in my original video I showed you sort of best practices, the gold standard of how to fit these kits. And yes, I do realise that there is an easier, quicker way of doing it. A lot of people have been asking. So in the fitting video for the Continental GT, I will be showing you a much easier way of doing it, a method that some people will feel more comfortable with. Now, I'm thinking that I'm possibly going to be able to get front and rear done in one video. We'll see how it works out. I'll get that filmed out as soon as the weather permits. Hopefully this video has clarified a few things for people. We'll see what happens in the comments section. I will of course leave a link in the video description down below if you want to have a look at prices, etc. for these parts. Once again, thank you so much for watching this and my other videos, and in doing so helping to support this channel. I really do appreciate it. Now, if you've enjoyed this video and found it useful, please leave a like, and if you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to this channel. It really does help me out. And if you do subscribe, don't forget to hit the notification bell and ensure that all your notifications are enabled. That way you will be informed whenever I upload a new video. I am of course going to be back on Friday, so until then, if you're riding, please ride safely, and I'll see you soon.